Without further ado, I would like to invite the President of USINDO, Ambassador David Murrell, to give his opening remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatia. USINDO Co-Chair Arifin Sirgar, Ati Sirgar, members of the USINDO Board of Advisors, welcome to tonight's program, and friends of Indonesia and U.S.-Indonesia relations all. Welcome to tonight's special historical lecture and open forum entitled The Origins of the Indonesian Nation, the Indonesian Revolution, 1945 to 1949. We're really in for a treat tonight. This is a period that is not well enough known even by those of us who follow Indonesian-American relations and Indonesian history. And what we do from time to time is to retell the story of that period using distinguished lecturers, usually from Cornell. We're going to have one again tonight, and you'll see that it's a fascinating period. I want to thank USAID Director Andy Sisson and Karen Levine, there are Levines and Levines, for loaning us and hosting us at their home tonight for this program. It makes it more special and more intimate, and we really do appreciate that. Andy, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, David. Karen and I just want to welcome you to our home, to this really special event with USINDO. This is all about promoting wonderful relations between the United States and Indonesia, and we're really proud to be part of it. And one of the great parts of my job is I get to learn something every day. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot tonight from this lecture. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope you have a good time.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. When you can teach a USAID director something, that's a special occasion. I'd like to introduce the co-chair of USINDO. USINDO is a binational organization. We have an Indonesian co-chair and an American co-chair. The Indonesian co-chair of USINDO, Dr. Arifin Sirgar. Dr. Sirgar was chairman of Bank Indonesia for a long time. He was Indonesian ambassador to the U.S. He was Minister of Trade, among many other distinguished positions. Dr. Arifin.
Thank you, David. Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Sisson, our kind host and hostess. Dear David, distinguished guest, Professor Eric Tagliacozzo, members of USINDO, and dear friends. When we today, on August the 15th, it means 2 days before August the 17th, ask a foreign resident or visitor to Indonesia, what is, in your view, the most important event in the history of the Republic of Indonesia? The common answer would most probably be the Declaration of Independence of Indonesia on August 17, 1945. The same answer would likely be given by most young Indonesians who tend to forget the background of the creation of the Republic of Indonesia. It is true that the Declaration of Independence of August 1945 is of crucial importance for the Republic of Indonesia as we know at present. However, Indonesia as a nation would not have emerged without the pledge of the youth from the different parts of Indonesia on October 28, 1928. On that date, as you may be familiar with, representatives of the youth from Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Bali, Maluku, and other islands came together and made a pledge that they have one nation, that is Indonesia, one country, that is Indonesia, and one language, that is Bahasa Indonesia. Before that event, thus, the concept of Indonesia as a nation or country did not exist, or at best, not generally known and adopted by the people of the different regions and islands, which were then formerly known as the Dutch East Indies, on Netherlands, India. It is thus understandable that, in my view, the most important event in the history of the Republic of Indonesia is the Youth Pledge of October 28, 1928. Then the relevant question arises, how was the situation before 1928? And what were the most important developments and transformations since that year until the Round Table Conference of 1949, which resulted in the recognition by the Dutch government of the independence of Indonesia? In order to respond to the question, we are very fortunate to have Professor Eric Tagliacozzo, who is going to enlighten us on the chain of historic events and developments, such as the rise of nationalism, the Japanese occupation period, the declaration of independence, as well as the struggle to defend it, and the Dutch military operations, leading ultimately to the formal transfer of sovereignty from the Dutch government to the Republic of Indonesia. In elaborating on the eventful and turbulent periods, Professor Tagliacozzo is paying special attention to the crucial role played by the US government as a mediator in the conflict between the Dutch and Indonesian governments during the decisive period 1945 to 1949. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Tagliacozzo is a professor of history at Cornell University, where he teaches Southeast Asian studies. He is a prolific and excellent author. He is the author of Secret Trades, Porous Borders, Smuggling, and States Along a Southeast Asian Frontier, which won the Harry Benda Prize for the Association of Asian Studies. He recently finished his second monograph, The Longest Journey, Southeast Asian and the Pilgrimage to Mecca. Professor Tagliacozzo is also the editor and co-editor of 4 books on history and anthropology. Furthermore, he's the director of the Comparative Muslim Society program at Cornell, the director of the Cornell Modern Indonesia project, and is editor of the journal Indonesia and other publications. You are indeed very fortunate having such a distinguished scholar as our main speaker this evening. Before the presentation to be made by Professor Tagliacozzo, I would like to mention that after the presentation, there will be an occasion of questions and answers. May I now kindly ask you, Professor Tagliacozzo, to start your presentation. Thank you.
I'm very, very honored to be here, and I want to thank David, first of all, for inviting me. It was very nice of him to do that, and for USINDO and their staff to help set this up. I also want to thank Pak Arifin Siregar for that very, very moving introduction, which I thought was very nice and overly generous. And the Sisson Levine family also for hosting us. I understand this is the first, and depending on how many dishes are broken, maybe the last one that is going to happen here. And finally, I also want to thank the staff from AIFIS, the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, which we have been working hard to erect here. And David and USINDO were very generous in allowing this event to be co-sponsored by AIFIS. I think you can see by the number of these different organizations being involved in this that the United States is really serious about Indonesia. There really is an effort underway to try to get to know Indonesia better, and that is something that will benefit everybody in this room. So thanks to all of those different bodies for making this possible. I'm going to just say one last thing, and that is that I punctured my eardrum 2 days ago, unfortunately, and that means I can't hear so well right now, and I'm also a little bit dizzy, so I'm going to just try to give my talk anyway, but if I can't hear what you're saying when you ask the question, please just forgive me and shout a little louder. That's also like Italian families. Just gesticulate when you talk, and okay. So I'm not an expert on the Indonesian Revolution. Obviously, I have to teach about it. I've been at Cornell for almost 15 years, and I teach about it every year. My first book was a history of smuggling in Indonesia and Malaysia in the colonial period, and I just finished a book that came out this year about the history of the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I'm interested in the Indonesian Revolution because I think it has things to teach us still about the world we live in right now. And it's a time, as I was just elucidated by Pak Arifin Siregar, that is actually starting to fade from memory because the people who lived through it are aging like the rest of us. And I think it's really important that we know what happened during this time. It's particularly important for Indonesians to know what happened during this time. So what I want to do in this lecture is to talk a little bit about the Indonesian Revolution, and because I'm a historian and not a sociologist or a political scientist or an I'm not a card-carrying anthropologist anyway, I want to think about this historically, and that is to say, look at what was going on before the revolution, both in terms of the beginnings of the nationalist project in Indonesia, also into the Japanese occupation, because this period was absolutely crucial in forming the Indonesian Revolution. Then the third part of the talk, I'll talk about the Indonesian Revolution itself. And finally, for the last part, I'll ask a little bit about what is still left with us from that time, for those of us who care about Indonesia, or who live in Indonesia, or who are in fact Indonesian. So those are the four things that I hope to talk about today. So let's start with the prelude to the revolution, thinking about some of the organizations of pre-war Indonesian nationalism that started to make something like this, an Indonesian revolution, possible. Now, it's easy in hindsight, 100 years later, to kind of try to map this out. It's not that easy, but it's easier in hindsight to map it out 100 years later, what was happening on the ground in all of the various different camps that started to become the Indonesian nationalist movement in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. You can imagine that being on the ground at the time would have been considerably more complicated. Nobody knew what was going on. There was a lot of different strands, or aliran, streams of different groups that were important in thinking about what to do about making something viable like an independent state of Indonesia. And I want to just mention a few of these possibilities. One of the most commonly stated organizations that gets mentioned for the beginnings of nationalism in Indonesia was a Javanese party called Budi Utomo, which got going in 1908. It was actually preceded by a year by the Insul Indi party, which was the party set up by many Indo people, and this was important. Perhaps you've heard of Edward Dawes Dekker, whose collection of papers is actually at Cornell, a fantastic collection of papers that gives us great insight into this period in Indonesian history. So there's a Javanese strain, there's an Indo strain, there is of course a Muslim strain. Sarekat Islam was founded in 1911. Muhammadiyah was founded only 1 year later in 1912. There's a very important Muslim strain. You've probably heard of Cokro Aminoto and his importance in the beginnings of Indonesian nationalism. So we've got Javanese, we've got Indos, we've got Muslims. There was also, of course, a communist tinge with the foundation of the Partai Komunis Indonesia, PKI, in 1920. A radical leftist fringe, people like Tan Malaka become very important in this story too. And again, particularly at Cornell, there has been a great fascination with Tan Malaka over time. And let me just get to one more out of the many different to choose from, and this would be a secular aliran that leads up into the revolution. That is with the founding of the Partai Nasional Indonesia, the PNI, in 1927. And here we're talking about people like Hatta, Syahrir, Sukarno, right? So there's a bevy of different people, a bevy of different parties, a bevy of different ideologies that are all starting. It's like a soup, right? Soto revolusi that you are making. You have to put in a lot of different ingredients into this soup, and what bubbles up to the top, nobody quite knows at the time. That's important. There are also cleavages in this revolution, this incipient revolution that may or may happen. What are some of the cleavages that take place during the time? Well, there are people who collaborated and those who chose not to collaborate. So even people who are heroes in Indonesian history, like Sukarno and Hatta, were in fact collaborators at select times. And this is something we have to remember because it was important during the occupation period by Japan. There are people who went underground, like Syahrir, like Tan Malaka, like the PKI. Okay, so there's one of these cleavages, those who collaborated versus those who went underground. There's also another cleavage, that those people who wanted independence, and you can include a number of these different aliran and a number of these different figures, to those who wanted more than independence. And here we're talking about people who wanted social revolution at the same time that there was going to be an independent Indonesia. And here we are talking really about the PKI, right, the Communist Party. A third of four important cleavages would be modernization versus feudalism. Pretty much all of the parties, all of the different aliran that I sketched out wanted modernization in one way or another, but there were also groups that had a much more feudal idea about what Indonesia might be. And I'm thinking here of people like the Susuhunan of Solo. This would be one important figure. Certain rajas, also the Ule Balang in Aceh, they were very important. These were groups that stuck much more closely to the Dutch than to this burgeoning group of people that we think of as Indonesian revolutionaries. Finally, one last cleavage that I think is important too, those who were nationalist in their orientation. And here, the most important group, of course, is the Partai Nasional Indonesia, with Sukarno, Hatta, etc., versus those who were internationalist in their orientation. And people like the PKI, the Communist Party, who had connections to communists elsewhere in Asia and in the world, and also Sarekat Islam, who had connections with Islamic organizations elsewhere in the world. Okay, so all of these things are important in thinking through the years leading up to the Japanese occupation. Now, once we get to the Japanese occupation, things get more complicated. I'd like to argue that we can think of the Japanese occupation in three important stages. Basically, from around mid-1942 to mid-1943. This is the first year of the Japanese occupation. This is a time that the Japanese are establishing their dominance in Indonesia, and they are making all kinds of promises to Indonesians. This is going to be, and not just to Indonesians, but to all Asians, this is going to be an Asia for Asians, this idea of a co-prosperity sphere. Many, many Indonesians really believed the Japanese when they came to Indonesia. We were just talking about this about half an hour ago. There were good reasons to believe the Japanese, that this rhetoric was not just rhetoric, but was something that was going to be carried out. If we move to the middle third of the Japanese occupation, from mid-1943 to 1944, all of the promises start to stop. This is when the Japanese are firmly in control of Indonesia, and they no longer have to make promises. And this is when Japan's occupation is revealed to be what it actually is, which is an even more stronger, and some would say worse form of colonialism than anything that had existed under the Dutch. And finally, there is the last third of the occupation, from roughly mid-1944 to mid-1945. This is when the Japanese realize they are losing the war, and they start to have to make promises to Indonesians again. And this really sweeps through this period of Indonesian history. You can imagine how confusing this must have been on the ground for Indonesians in just the space of 3 years to see the occupation turn along all of the axes that I just described. Now, how were the Japanese actually able to take over and rule this gigantic archipelago of 17,000 islands? This is very important for thinking about the revolution that comes right after the occupation. I want to argue that there were four main ways that the Japanese were able to do this. One of these was the Joyo Boyo prophecy. And this is very interesting because this was a Javanese prophecy that said that the rule of whites was going to come to an end with the coming of a yellow race to the Indies. And the Japanese found out about this and actually used the Joyo Boyo prophecy to explain their arrival to many in Indonesia, but particularly in Java. Not everybody believed the Joyo Boyo prophecy, but the Japanese used this on the ground very self-consciously to try to justify their arrival. The second way that the Japanese were able to take over this enormous archipelago had to do with Bahasa Indonesia. And this is very interesting as well. The Dutch first emphasized Bahasa Indonesia in the 1920s for use in the colonial bureaucracy. Of course, the Dutch they were only a tiny minority ruling this enormous colonial empire in Indonesia, they required the use of Indonesians to be able to staff this bureaucracy. So Bahasa Indonesia became important in the 1920s, and the Japanese institutionalized Bahasa Indonesia as the national language. This linked the 17,000 islands together with one language, really for the first time in a much more thorough way than the Dutch had ever imagined before this. Before this time, if you were Minangkabau and you met someone from Java, you might be able to speak to each other, but you might not be able to speak to each other. You're Bugis, I'm Batak. Maybe we can speak to each other, but it's not going to be that easy. It's only in this time period, the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s particularly, that we start to see Indonesians being able to talk to each other on a much larger scale. And the Japanese helped this along. A third of 4 important ways that the Japanese were able to help along the Indonesian revolution that would come after this had to do with one man, and that was Sukarno. Sukarno became the mouthpiece of the Japanese war effort in Indonesia, particularly through the invention of a new technology, which to us in early 21st century world seems like an incredibly old technology, but then wasn't, and that is the radio. It's very, very difficult for me to get my students in faraway, cold Ithaca, New York, to understand how powerful the radio was. They all have their clicking devices, whatever you call these things, smartphones. They're all clicking away, sometimes during my lecture, which is a terrible sin. But they are using this technology to be in contact with each other. It's difficult to explain to young 18 to 22-year-olds how powerful the radio was. If you hear voice broadcasts of the young Sukarno on a radio crackling over the 17,000 islands of Indonesia in the 1920s and 1930s into the 1940s, you understand what the power of charisma is. Finally, a fourth and last important way that the Japanese were able to help set the preconditions for the Indonesian Revolution had to do with Islam. The Japanese forced a merger of all of the different Muslim parties into one giant Muslim party called Masyumi. And this was very important. They trained a volunteer army of 57,000 young Muslim Indonesians to use these young Indonesian men against the Allies. This was in 1943. And they trained this army, and this army was infiltrated towards the end of the war by young Indonesian Republicans, by the revolutionaries. They freed many jailed Muslims from jail. These were men who knew how to use guns when the war ended. They were not just young men who thought they wanted something called a united Indonesia. They knew how to use the guns to get it. And the Japanese were responsible for this as well. Okay? And I want to just point out that there was only one organization in pre-war Indonesia that opposed both the Dutch and the Japanese during the occupation, and that was the Communist Party. This was the only organization that opposed both of the colonial powers that took over Indonesia. Now we get to the end of the war. I've given you the 3 different periods from mid-42 to 43, mid-43 to 44, mid-44 to 45. We finally come to the end of the war, and as Arif Sinugar said, on 17 August 1945, independence is declared by Sukarno and Hatta. This is just days after the atomic bombs were dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indonesia pronounces itself to be a nation. Whether Indonesia was going to be a nation was a completely different story on the ground. And that's what I want to spend the next part of the lecture talking about. I want to talk a little bit about 3 things: the economic effects of the Japanese occupation on and its later ramifications on the revolution, also the political effects, and finally the cultural effects of the occupation, all on how they conditioned the Indonesian Revolution of 45 to 49. Let's talk first just about a few of the economic effects of the revolution. During the time of the occupation, the Japanese actually were faced with the fact that the export orientation of the Dutch had turned Indonesia into the world's single most profitable colony in the history of colonization. Let me repeat that. The Dutch turned Indonesia into the single most profitable colony in the history of colonization. Anywhere on the world, if you look at the percentages for how much the Dutch put in and how much they took out, It is a larger percentage here than anywhere else. The British Raj doesn't compare. The French in Indochina doesn't compare. The Italians, I'm sorry to say, in northeastern Africa, not even close. Italians were not good colonials. That's something we can take at least some pride in. But this is very important because the Japanese really had forced rice and labor requisitions from Indonesians, and it meant that there was a huge amount of unattended paddy land. Particularly in Sumatra, something like 1/3 of all Sawa land lay unattended by the end of the war. That is a lot of hungry mouths to feed in Indonesia. The economics of that are important. As Japan loses, the external supply lines to Japan are cut, and this means there is privation and isolation for Indonesians as well. So these are some of the economic effects of the occupation that you can imagine might lead Indonesians towards something like revolution. What about the political effects of the occupation? These were just as important. Indonesia was cut off, isolated, and because of this, developed a sense of collective identity in the midst of this isolation. First, they were cut off from Holland by the ferocity and quickness of the Japanese advance in 1942, and then by the end of the war in 1945, they were cut off from Japan as well. So after 3 centuries of being of having links to Europe, and then 3 years of having links to Japan, all of a sudden Indonesia was on its own at the end of the war, and this was very, very important. This forced unity of all different parties that the Japanese did, that I mentioned a moment ago. All of the Muslim parties must go into Masyumi, all of the non-Muslim parties must go into a secular grouping. Also, this forces collective identity among Indonesians. We start to see Indonesians, again, no matter where they're from, Minangkabau, Batak, Bugis, from Lombok, from any other place, they start to see themselves as being in something together. This is very, very important. There is also the emergence of a new political elite during Japanese times of men who are oriented towards political theater. This is very, very important. This leaves men in place who know how to use the tools of political theater. Sukarno and his undoubted charisma. Hatta and his undoubted organizational skills. These were very, very important. These were skills learned during the occupation and then afterwards utilized during the revolutionary period. Okay. Let me just end this middle section of the talk by talking about some cultural factors of the occupation that led into the revolution as well. And one of these, I think that we can argue, is an atmosphere of extraordinariness. This idea that Holland had ruled the Indies for 3 centuries and they were swept aside by the Japanese in the space of a matter of months. That is incredible. After you've been told for 3 centuries that the people who rule you, who happen to have lighter skin than you, are simply superior because of the way they look or because of the place they are from, to watch this being swept aside in the matter of a couple of months, and then for the Japanese to come, this was really an astonishing message to most Indonesians. Holland was revealed to be a paper tiger, basically, and this was extremely important. There was also rapid changes caused by high inflation. This was wartime inflation. The cost of everything cost a huge amount of money, and because things cost so much money, black markets appeared everywhere. There were alternate means of authority for how the economy worked, and this became incredibly important in the undermining of institutions, something that became very important in mobilizing Indonesians as well. Also, Indonesians started to come into the cities in much larger numbers. They came face to face with one another through mass urban migrations during the Japanese period as well. This also becomes of utmost importance. And finally, there was an overall politicization of Indonesia during this time. During the occupation, some 1.5 million young people, or pemuda, were organized by the Japanese into various different units, and a lot of these relationships that were made during the Japanese occupation became very important in the period afterwards. Let me just talk a little bit about the actual chronology, just for 5 to 7, 8 minutes, something like this, about the actual chronology of the revolution, because I think it's important. We mentioned that in 17 August 1945, Indonesian independence is declared by these 2 men, Sukarno, the Javanese, Hatta from Sumatra. It's very interesting to think of these two men together. Oftentimes when there's times of great political upheaval, we often see two men of very different character and disposition together like this. It makes me think of Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo in South Africa. One, the very sober man behind the scenes, i.e. Hatta and Tambo. The other one, the very fiery, charismatic orator, someone like Mandela or someone like Sukarno. Sukarno, as you know, was a man of great appetites. That's one way of putting it. In the United States, we have also had leaders of great appetites. Sukarno apparently, early on in his reign as Indonesia's first president, used to fly in a helicopter over the Javanese countryside so he could look at Javanese women bathing nude in streams. This is a little bit like some of the presidents we've had recently in the United States. I imagine Sukarno and Bill Clinton, for example, a good president by my estimation, sitting down and comparing notes on how to have appetites about various things. This seems to be something that is common, though, that there is one person out in front who is the larger-than-life personality, one person more withdrawn who is actually getting the day-to-day work of revolution done. The first Allied forces that return after the Indonesian state is proclaimed in August are not actually Dutch, they're British. And this is important because Sukarno and Hatta's government was already functioning for several months before the Dutch actually showed up. So the first allies who come back are British, and they are not actually, most of them, white British people from England. They are Indians, both Muslims and Hindus, who come back from the colonial armed forces of the British. And there are pitched battles fought in various parts of Java, but particularly in Surabaya, between these British colonial troops and the young Pemuda, Japanese-trained young revolutionaries, young Republicans. Indonesians attack the Japanese barracks and actually take a lot of these guns before the Allies come back, so that when the Allies start actually landing in Indonesia, they are not just facing young people who want to have a nation of their own, but young people who want to have a nation of their own with guns and the knowledge of how to use those guns. This becomes very important. I think the United States, it's fair to say, and Roosevelt in particular, their standpoint was ambivalent at this point in 1945, 1946. The idea of a progressive liberation for Indonesians was already very much on the cards in Washington, I think. But at the same time, the United States wanted to support its allies, and the Dutch were considered to be an ally. They wanted to help rebuild Holland after the war. There was also very deep fear in Washington that Asians were going to be turning towards Moscow. This was even before the war had ended, and this was very much in Washington's thinking as well. There was also the very clear fact that Indonesia was the single largest prize in this part of the war theater of South and Southeast Asia. It had oil, it had gas, it had timber, it had all different kinds of other natural resources, and it was astride the Straits of Malacca and Sunda Straits, so it was important. So the United States wanted to get this right. And I'm going to talk more, I'm going to come back to the United States' role in this in a moment. It's important to note, though, that after the war ended, the Communist Party was reestablished after being banned, and the government was reformed with a new prime minister and a new cabinet. Sharir and Sharifuddin become very important, and Muslims and the military were kept to the side of this by the Indonesians who had taken over in late 45 and into early 46. This has echoes later during the revolution as well. By later 1946, later in that year, the Dutch had re-arrived, and it becomes clear that the Dutch are going to try to take back their colony. Meanwhile, the communists, the PKI, after reforming, have been pushed into the bush, basically, outside of the cities, and it becomes clear that peasants are starting to rally around some of these PKI agendas, while in the cities, the young Indonesian nationalists are trying to build up a very different kind of project. And these are not the same projects, what is going on in the hinterland and what is going on in the cities. And really, it is starting to become clear that only one person is going to bridge these two projects. And again, there's that man, Sukarno. a little bit more foreshadowing of what's to come. Between 1946 and 1948, we have a litany of agreements and broken agreements between the Dutch and the Republican movement. The Dutch land in Java, in several different places. They land in Sumatra. There's all different kinds of smuggling going on between the Indonesian Republicans and Malaysia in particular. Guns and supplies are being run, and this becomes very important. And at the same time, the PKI is actually being taken on by these young Indonesian revolutionaries and is being pushed to the side. Tan Malaka is finally dealt with by the young Indonesian revolutionaries. And at the same time that the Dutch are breaking these agreements, the young Indonesian Republicans are trying to deal not only with the Dutch, but with this, what is considered to be this radical leftist fringe that is epitomized by the PKI. And this culminates in the Madiun affair. This becomes very, very important because the United States actually starts to throw its weight much more behind the Republicans once this happens. Once it's felt, even if there were United States sympathies towards the Republicans before this time, there was also realpolitik involved. And once it was felt that the Indonesian revolutionaries were dealing with the communists, especially in this age of paranoia about who's going to choose sides, Moscow or Washington, much more aid was forthcoming. With the USS Renville in January 1948, agreements were signed, and the US was really a very important part of this process. They were a third party to the Indonesian Republicans and the Dutch from earlier on than this time. They now are really pushing the Dutch towards making an agreement with the Republicans, and by 1949 it becomes clear, partially because of American support of these Republicans, but even more so because of the blood that the Republicans themselves spilled on the ground against the Dutch up until this time, that the Dutch position is becoming less and less tenable. Not just the United States, but also the global community is less and less on the side of Holland coming back and returning to its colony. And by late 1949, we have the declaration again of the Republic of Indonesia. Into 1950, the US had threatened the Dutch by this time that they would cancel the funds that were coming to rebuild Holland after the war. And they followed through on this threat. They made it clear that Holland would not get about $1 billion in Marshall Funds plans unless they cooperated and tried to have a ceasefire with the Republicans. This was not the reason why Indonesia was able to successfully have this revolution, but it certainly helped, I think. Let me just finish with a few last thoughts. Boy, I can stand up here and talk without even hearing. It's amazing. I want to just talk to you about two different interpretations of the Indonesian Revolution that I think are very important. And I'll just mention a third very quickly at the end. And then I want to just ask how much of this is still with us now in early 21st century Indonesia, some 60 years after the fact. Now, one of these interpretations that I think has been really, really important is a Cornell interpretation. And I'm not giving it because it's a Cornell interpretation, but because it's really been the most important interpretation for a long time, and that's my colleague and friend Ben Anderson from his book Java in a Time of Revolution. Ben basically said that the Indonesian Revolution was not explainable in a kind of traditional Marxist mold of what a revolution is. When we talk about what a revolution is, there's the a kind of an alienation of the intelligentsia, there's the frustration of rising expectations, there's a certain language for what a leftist revolution is supposed to mean. Ben Anderson says, rather, this is really, the emphasis needs to be on the youth, on the pemuda. The pemuda were absolutely vital for making this revolution happen. They were molded through culture, but they were also molded through the Japanese. And that is why I've spent a fair bit of time talking about the Japanese in this lecture. He highlights in this book Shahrir and Tan Malaka's dichotomy. These were the two different, this was the question that was being grappled with by young Indonesians trying to figure out what they were going to have. Can we have a successful national revolution at the same time that we have a social revolution? Is this possible? Is this possible? And for almost all of the Indonesian revolutionary leaders, Shahrir, Sukarno, Hatta, Sharifuddin, the answer was no. We need to build our state first, then we will try to build some kind of equality. The only major figure who didn't fall along these lines was Tan Malaka. And again, There's a reason why Tan Malaka is so popular at lefty Cornell. It's not an accident. Tan Malaka's defeat reinforced the political moderates, Ben says, and it really diminished the potential for serious reforms to happen once the revolution was over. And so it's really an indictment, in a way, that Ben Anderson gives in explaining why Tan Malaka lost out to the people who eventually became the heroes of the revolution. Okay? A second take on the Indonesian Revolution that I think is very important too, and I'm happy to say this because now I know that there are several people in the room who got their degrees at Ohio University, and also so I don't feel like I'm constantly trumpeting Cornell, because I don't mean to do that, is William Frederick's book, which has one of the most elegant titles I've ever heard for a book, called Visions and Heat, The Making of the Indonesian Revolution. When I hear that title, it makes me think of Indonesia in the 1940s, how hot it always is, and the kind of the visions that people must have had at this time. I think it's a great evocative title. This is a very revisionist take on what the Indonesian Revolution was. He emphasizes the continuities and not the sharp breaks of 1942 and 1945, which I described before. And it's firmly focused on Surabaya, not on Jakarta, where much of the action of the revolution takes place in Jakarta, Jogja. This book is really focused on Surabaya. He de-emphasizes the pemuda, the youth, and he de-emphasizes the extraordinariness of this revolutionary time and of the Japanese occupation. And he says rather that much of the revolution came from below, from the urban masses that were much more important to the revolution than has been previously thought of. And I think this is a very interesting counterbalance to the Andersonian vision of what the Indonesian Revolution was. So when I teach classes to PhD students, I try to have them, these days nobody wants to read whole books. You're lucky if you can get people to read articles. But I really want the students to read those two books side by side, because you really see totally different visions of what this revolution could have been and how to explain it. Okay? I'm going to mention just one last book, and that is a book in Dutch that just came out by Boyo. It's a new book, which is probably the single most comprehensive treatment of the revolution. I literally just held it in my hand. It was still hot because it had just come off the press. So if you read Dutch, there is a new version that has just come out, which is literally that thick and looks to be really worth reading. I'm going to read it as soon as I can, but it just came out. Let me just end with three very quick thoughts on what the legacy of the Indonesian Revolution has been for Indonesia over the last 60 years. And these are just thumbnail sketches of what I think, three things only that I think we can take from that time and what it still means for thinking about Indonesia and how much of this is still with us. The first is a culture of violence. I think this culture of violence was rooted in the conflicts that really split the country under Dutch rule repeatedly during this part of the 20th century. Violence was really one of the lessons learned during the occupation, and the figures who were associated with authority or with the status quo were attacked, and there were killings and beheadings and all kinds of violence that was perpetrated against people who were seen to be an enemy. This took place against regents, it took place against the wealthy, against sultans, against Chinese merchants, against all sorts of targets. And you often see a number of these same targets still on display in Indonesia once we go to 1965 and even once we go to 1998. So this culture of violence is one of the things that I think we still see as a legacy of this period. A second thing that I think we see still from this period as part of the Indonesian landscape and directly leading from the revolutionary period has to do with Islam as a banner for the disaffected. We see this in the Darul Islam movement, which takes place from the 40s into all the way up to 1962 before it was really crushed. But it continued the seeds of earlier attempts to make Islam the cause of Indonesia, going all the way back to Sarekat Islam and Muhammadiyah in 1911 and 1912, almost exactly 100 years ago today. So when we think about what some of the Islamist parties in Indonesia are doing now, there is actually a direct genealogy back to some of these historical events that were taking place at, exactly 100 years ago today. Finally, the last thing that I want to just highlight, and then I'm going to end this talk, and maybe we can just have a discussion, not so much Q&A if it's okay, but just a discussion all of us together. That is what I would prefer, because I don't have all the answers, and I think there's a lot of people here who lived through a lot of this, who know this period much better than I do. But I think the third thing that I want to remember from this period leading up to the present is how important the fragmented nature of the army has been in Indonesian history. It used to be there was a journal run out of Cornell called Indonesia. It's been run since 1966, and it is basically the most important academic journal in the world for thinking about Indonesian studies, with one or two others as well. But it's a very important journal, and for many, many decades, the journal Indonesia had a standard feature in it called Data on the Indonesian Military Elite. And for decades, my senior colleagues like Ben Anderson, George Cahan, and others collected data on the Indonesian military elite and published it in the journal Indonesia, which was available to anyone in the world who wanted to know what was going on in the politics of Indonesia and how important the generals had been. And this feature has only been discontinued in the last couple of years, because it's been, the journal is now moving in new directions, and it was thought that it's time to think about other things and not to devote that space to this. But I sometimes wonder if this was a mistake, because when you think about the election that is coming up, when you think about the revolution that is in our past, when you think about what connects the past to the present, the generals are never very far behind from that. And it's something to think about as you go to the polls in coming days. So why don't I stop there and just thank you very much for coming out to hear me.